question. Go ahead.
Reverend Sharpton, hello. I'm Vivek, and I want to ask you, last week on the show we had Senator Kerry, and this week and the week before we had Senator Edwards. And my question for you is, of all the Democratic candidates out there, why should I vote for the one with the least political experience?
Well, you shouldn't, because I have the most political experience. I got involved in the political movement when I was 12 years old. And I've been involved in social policy for the last 30 years. So don't confuse people that have a job with political experience. Whoever the head of some local bureaucracy has a job in Cambridge, that doesn't mean that they have political experience, and it doesn't mean they have the experience to run the United States government. So I think that we confuse title holders with political experience, as we have seen with the present occupant in the White House. George Bush was a governor and clearly has shown he doesn't have political experience.
Fan of politics, Vivek Ramaswamy there. Asking like what sounds like a planted question, like
100%.
Generic ass crap you would ask, you would expect like a member, someone who would go to MSNBC taping to ask in that era.
Well, I mean, I think, frankly, the big red flag about Vivek there is not so much him asking the kind of stupid loaded question about how genuinely impressed he was by that little bit of rhetoric right there. I mean, like the oldest kind of like, that's, skilled politician. We're giving, our friend, the Reverend, like a lot of credit here, but like, that's just like a very, that's somebody who knows how to be a public speaker. And to be sort of bamboozled in the way that Ramaswamy seems to be in that clip, big red flag for their capacity to be able to be in politics.
Just dazzled.
I mean, and it makes sense with how ridiculous a lot of his campaign planks are. I mean, it's very much dorm room kind of high conversation stuff.
Including the one that would make, I think, anybody, like, I think it's been interpreted as like an anti-migrant or somehow like anti-black, like sort of poll test sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But as far as I can tell, he would have anybody, like you lose your right to vote until you pass a sort of like civics test.
So this is like my when I ran across this the first time, it was a few weeks ago. So maybe he's revised his platform, but the first time he said he was saying that he wants to raise the age to 25. And for people in that kind of 7-year gap, you have to either join the military, pass the test, and I think maybe or be a cop, right? Was another one, because that's one thing we need much more of as policemen.
Sir, what if I'm a first responder? Did you
he called it first responder? Yeah, he called it first responder, not cop, but code cop, right?
Right.
I mean, so we got a fun program, everybody. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Nick Bowlin, who is an excellent journalist over there at High Country News. We're going to be talking about a piece he wrote for the Drift magazine on mining. He went to a pretty prestigious mining conference up in Canada, and it was interesting. I mean, we talked a lot about the kind of the geopolitical aspects of mining as there's more demand for things like lithium to power renewable batteries and more electric vehicles and things like that. But also just sort of how like that, not to make too big a deal out of it, but the right wing's getting really upset about ESG and all these kind of things. And the mining corporations, right? These people who are very clearly historically like in the wrong, especially when it comes to indigenous rights. We're making a big deal about doing land acknowledgements at the beginning of all their talks and things like that.
Well, this is something like Canada folks will be very familiar with this, because they really do the land acknowledgement there, whether it's like, actual people who give a shit and then just a sort of general society sort of, it's like a totem, like, oh, now we're good. Right. Yeah. It's really cynical.
I mean, yeah, it's like, it's like going to confession. Right. So anyways, we talked about that and Lula and South America and stuff like that. It was a really great conversation. That's coming up in a little bit. I know we have a breakdown coming up of our good friend of the show, Mayor Fry. Before we get there, and I know you've probably done it a lot, Matt, but I'm curious, what your thoughts were on the debate. I know I talked about it on my stream, and I know you definitely had to stay up late and watch on the Majority Report. But anything impressed you there? Any kind of top line thoughts on the debate?
My opinion on the debate is shifting a little bit from my initial reaction. My initial reaction was all these people are losers. I think a lot of this still holds, by the way. All these people are losers. DeSantis is super pathetic, which by contrast makes Vivek look kind of impressive. But I think it could be easily overstated by the same people who've been overstating DeSantis, how strong Ramaswamy is. But the other and I thought everybody kind of diminished themselves for taking part, but I don't know now. And there's a poll here, and look, this could change, but it made me think along lines that I haven't heard elaborated by say political pundits, which is, Trump is still in the peak position, which is sort of our generic sort of expectation. But he's been down every one of these since the primary really kicked off. He's peaked at 62, dropped 59, dropped to 56. And most importantly, since the debate, has dropped 6 whole points down to 50, which is the lowest mark here. But also interesting is DeSantis benefited slightly, but Ramaswamy didn't. So a lot of what we're talking about might all be bullshit still.
Yeah. This is the time of the year when everyone was like, Ted Cruz is going to be the next president of the United States of America, right?
But what I will say is, like, our coverage got fucking numbers. And I don't know if that's just like Majority Report's bigger than it was for the previous things. That's definitely accounts for some of it. But there's an appetite to watch these collection of absolute losers. And in a way that, like, look, I think Trump's going to win still, and I think he can win with only like 40% with ever going like that's what I think how he won in 2016. But I think the possibility that it gets close enough to be more interesting and entertaining, I'm hoping that happens.
This is a hot take, and I say that because it's influenced just by these poll numbers and the aftermath of last week. I think there's probably a very high chance that Trump has to participate in some of the upcoming debates.
I think so. Because I mean, we heard a lot of hot air about, from Trump himself,
which is a shame because his conversation, like wild rambling conversation that he did with Tucker Carlson was probably one of the most unhinged and hilarious Donald Trump interviews I've ever seen in my life. And I could do with a few more of those, but no, I think he's going to have to be on the stage, if not the next one, very soon.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what these numbers, because Trump himself the day after, he's like, yeah, more people watched that interview than watched was it Barbara Walters talk to Michael Jackson? It's like, bro, no, that's not how those views work. And at the same time, Rumble was all like, hey, actually, we have extremely high viewership for this debate. And I didn't believe it because I think they're lying too. I just don't buy their numbers. But I do think that, like, Trump can't just sit these out. It's going to diminish him, actually. And I thought that's very interesting because, especially because there is no one. Vivek ain't gonna be it. DeSantis is like dead in the water. I mean, if they can get his ass animated up, I'd be very impressed.
No,
there's like no one, but there is a hunger there. So that's where I'm at with the debate now.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think Ramaswamy is one of those guys who is going to crater pretty fast because I think his thing, the people who it turns on, his kind of like snide attitude. I think there might be a ceiling there. I do think it's interesting that Nikki Haley, somebody who's like, I wouldn't say is the most skilled politician in general, but she was able to carve out a little bit of a lane for herself. But again, like a loser lane, like not any kind of like, oh, Nikki Haley has a shot to win this kind of thing. But she might be the person who like the never Trumpers in the Republican Party get behind because she was one of the most hawkish, for example, on like Israel and Russia on the stage.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it would be honestly, yeah. I don't know. It's hard to say who I want to see climb the polls less. Burgum. I want to see Burgum climb the polls the most.
The Burgum boys.
I want the Burgermeister who just is even at 1%. I want
Isn't he doing one of those scam things with his donations?
Yeah, I can't remember who told me this, but yeah, he basically said, basically giving away shit for
A
small
lot of these guys
donations.
are doing it. I know. I think the mayor of Miami is also doing it because they all need to have so many donors to get on these debates. So they're just
Which
giving
is
people
so
money.
it's such like it's so beautiful like example of like, oh yeah, we're gonna do this because this is gonna be a proxy for democratic participation. That's like, oh yeah, fuck that. Let's just completely game that shit.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, we'll have more
Well,
on these as we go. Yeah.
yeah, I was gonna say, speaking of, threats and just sort of scoffing at democracy, let's talk about Mayor Jacob Fry in Minneapolis. So yeah, like, I have this here. Folks, there's a threat to democracy in Minneapolis and Minnesota generally. It's not just, well, I guess mainly Minneapolis, but it's not just the Minnesota GOP, which is a problem. Am I slowing down, David? Is that why you're?
But
Shoot.
you're catching up.
Hmm. Okay, yeah. Well, any, it's when I share this, isn't it?
It might be. Do you have it on your computer?
Yeah, yeah. I have the Canva up. If you want to pull up the Jacob Fry
Okay. Yeah. Just give me
Canva.
1 second. I'll grab it for you.
Sorry about that. Well,
No worries.
so yeah, Jacob Fry, who we talked about, and a good sort of primer for this. I'm really slowing down, and can I make it through?
I mean, if you need to reset, you can reset, and I can talk a little bit more about the
Maybe we
GOP.
do Bowlin, and I try to sort my internet out.
All right, that sounds good. Let's do that.
Yeah.
So, do you have? Are you gonna play the bowling?
Yep. Got
All
that
right.
here. Sorry, folks.
So we'll come back and we're going to talk about our boy Lil Fry. But before that, we're going to jump straight to our conversation with Nick Bowlin. Again, Nick Bowlin's a really excellent journalist at High Country News, and he wrote this piece for the Drift. There's a link below in the show notes for y'all to read it. I really do suggest reading the piece because there's a lot of the kind of politics. And like the questions about mining and what this is going to mean, but also just sort of seeing what's going on at these conferences behind the scenes is really interesting. And maybe to set this up a little bit, there's a real question and a lot of different paths that are in front of not just this country but the globe, right? With how we deal with energy transition. Obviously, I'm a supporter of programs like a Green New Deal, mass investment, and expansion of these kind of things. But there's the reality that if we're building out, for example, a lot of solar panels and batteries, or even something like nuclear, what we didn't talk about too much, there's going to be more demand for certain kind of minerals and resources. Well, that means somebody's going to have to go and dig them up. Problem is that under capitalism, those forces are all held under private hands who don't very much care for labor rights, for the dignity of the global South, and certainly not for left-wing governments in the Americas and across the globe. So we had Nick on to talk about this conference, what the perspective is like for the mining industry, and also talk a little bit about maybe some of the alternatives, potential alternatives. So really fun conversation, and we'll be back in a little bit with this Fry story.
Yep.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here. And I'm really thrilled to be joined by a return guest on the program, Nick Bowlin. Nick Bowlin's a freelance journalist and a correspondent for the excellent High Country News. Nick, thanks so much for coming back on Left Reckoning.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you wrote this really incredible piece, and I'll just put it up on the screen for folks right quick. It's called A Good Prospect in the Drift magazine, Mining Climate Anxiety for Profit. And we'll have links below for people to go and read the full piece. And I highly suggest it. It's a really interesting analysis. And also some of the stuff you got these people to say to you is very interesting. And it's about mining and some of the kind of pressures that we are going to be facing as we maybe make some of these transitions to more green and renewable energy. But maybe to set the piece up, Nick, I mean, could you tell people about what you did for this piece and what the PDAC is?
Yeah, so the PDAC, and I'll probably refer to it as PDAC going forward here, but it is the largest annual mining conference in the world. It takes place in Toronto every March, and I went, on behalf of the Drift magazine, in part because from everything I've heard covering mining, that this is kind of the most obvious kind of weather vane of where what the mining industry thinks is coming, how it's feeling about the market. And I went in March of this year, and it was just consumed by excitement about the amount of money this industry is going to make off of the battery metal boom. So for kind of some context for that, the Biden White House, for example, expects lithium and cobalt demand, other kind of EV battery metals, to grow by 4,000% in coming decades. And I could throw a ton of different numbers at you, but these are the largest mining companies in the world. It's 25,000 mining people descend on Toronto every March, and they are just, I would hope you all read the piece or some of it. I can't overstate how excited they are about global demand for this stuff, and the ways in which, in some ways, they have kind of world governments in a corner. So a lot of the piece kind of gets into the geopolitics of this stuff, where the industrialized North is suddenly looking at how much copper they're going to need and the amount of copper there is in the world and where it is in the world, and suddenly realizing we need to lock in our supply chains right now. And this just, it's when you look at the scarcity there, these mining corporations they're just going to rake it in.
And I mean, at least in the model that looks likely, of private capital playing a big role in it. I mean, these folks feel like they're about to be big winners, right? I mean, that was the vibe at PDAC, right? Is like a big almost celebration. Yeah.
No, yeah, it was, and the mining industry is so boom and bust. I was hearing these stories about, like, there was a big gold and silver crash in 2014, and PDAC is like this wasteland, and everyone's talking about layoffs and all the money they've lost, and now it's the exact opposite. It was kind of a party atmosphere. I was going out late with all these mining guys to bars in Toronto, and everyone's just thrilled. Because they're kind of right on the crest of the next boom. But yeah, to kind of give you a sense of the atmosphere, the first kind of keynote speech, so this is taking place in the Toronto Convention Center. And one side of the building is just this big open floor, and it's mining companies and geochemistry firms and consultants and selling diamond drilling diamond drill bits for mining stuff. It's kind of every side of the industry. They have booths, and you can just walk up and down the aisles and talk to people, and talk to gold miners from Mongolia. It's really kind of fun. But then there are also kind of speeches and panels and stuff, and the opening keynote was from the head of battery metals at the consulting firm McKinsey. His name's Ken Hoffman. He's kind of a big deal in the mining world. And he, kind of ran through the market dynamics, and his estimate was in the next decade or so, an additional $15 to $20 trillion for the mine in increased on top of kind of what they would be making otherwise, just because of battery metal demand. And this is the mining world, where they don't always have a great relationship with climate and environmental activists. But the framing of the conference was so interesting, where they would periodically kind of refer to like an environmentalist who wasn't in the room, but who probably would not always be on their side. And Hoffman's, I quote it in the piece, but Hoffman kind of talks to this person periodically and is like, to fix climate change, you need us. And this was, this is a very common kind of attitude you come across in the mining world, where, they kind of see themselves as the pragmatists of the world. You all want to have cobalt in your phones. You all want to have, in the computers that we're on right now, which is true. You all want to have copper. You all want to have 3 cars, but all have them be EVs. Well, if that's the case, you need us to kind of dig up the planet. And you want to you want to kind of look away from the impacts of your consumer demands. Well, we're the ones who actually kind of are going to get the job done for you. Of course, the world doesn't have to be set up this way, and I get into this in my piece, and we can talk about this going forward. But this is very much, if they look at expected global demand, they are not wrong. Just kind of bottomless amounts of, we don't know how far how far this is going to go, but with the amount we need just in kind of the U.S. and Europe to decarbonize, let alone with really large growing populations in China and India and Brazil and in Western Africa. If all of those people are going to be consuming energy that isn't from fossil fuels, I mean, there is a certain sense in which the mining industry is saying this because they want our money, but they're also saying it because it's true. I mean, we're going to need a ton of lithium and copper to get away from fossil fuels. Just, with the way the world is right now, I mean, these corporations are just set to be kind of the primary beneficiaries of that. And the losers of this boom are, well, we can talk about that later, but
yeah, I mean, no, I mean, it's like, I mean, I think this is like a really important, I mean, this piece is really excellent and really well reported. And I also think, it brings up a kind of challenge to, people on the left and people who are like advocating for certain kind of changes that, there's already the fight with fossil fuel corporations, but then there's also going to be a fight about how we are, producing these things. And I want to get into like the big politics, right? Both domestically in the US and international in a minute. But just, just specifically on PDAC, because one thing that I thought was sort of interesting was you noted, for example, certain kinds of language, things like land acknowledgements, which in my opinion is a little ironic coming from mining capitalists, knowing the history there. I mean, I'm curious, like, just on that, like, because like the right makes a big deal. Oh, ESG is basically making industry limp, and woke capital's taking over. I'm curious though, because you did mention this was happening, in a few speeches here and there. I mean, is this something that is meant, in these speeches and these conversations? Is this meant for like a general audience, or is this something that you feel like the mining industry might be sort of consuming themselves to maybe make themselves feel better about their role in the world?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, Canada, I mean, part of this is a Canadian context where they have a little bit more of a robust history of trying to include First Nations in mining decisions. Now, including them doesn't mean that the mines don't get built. They sort of always get built, but, kind of compared to the U.S., they do tend to have a little bit kind of more rigorous tribal consultation process. On the other hand, I mean, it was really in your face, the kind of, talking about companies talking about their emissions reduction goals, increasing the amount of women in the workforce, and then all these panels about, indigenous corporations, talking to the tribes nearby your mine, making sure. And it was a lot of kind of the mining industry patting itself on the back. You'd have the DEI officer from Barrick or, one of the big boys coming in and talking. And
sorry, not to interrupt you, but like the attendees here, I mean, is there any kind of labor representation, or is it like that? Yeah.
Not a lot of labor in the room. There were pretty, a fairly significant number of tribal representatives. Often from Canadian First Nations. And, this is just one of the many nuances of mining. Same thing in the U.S., especially in Nevada. There's a lot of tribes whose economic livelihood is really tied to mining because the mining's happening on their, ancestral lands or near the reservation or something. So, when these tribal representatives are saying, hey, mining's good for us, we've got to deal with this gold company that gives us jobs, that's something that, environmentalists who kind of knee-jerk oppose mining should probably take seriously. On the other hand, the way PDAC was talking about, its relationships to tribes was kind of completely ahistorical, because the mining industry is probably one of the top forces for displacing indigenous people in the history of the world. I mean, I think one of the first things Christopher Columbus did in the New World was build a gold mine, and it's kind of it's kind of been versions of that ever since. Settlement of the Western U.S. as a primary example. And so, going forward, an enormous amount of these minerals that we need are found, on or near tribal nations. Also, just kind of in really poor parts of the global South, in Western Africa, in South America, where the relationship to the industrial North has been, extractive. From the very beginning. We can get into talking about Chile, but one of the reasons Chile's kind of has this more robust, kind of mining policy, meant to trying to make the companies pay up and have some benefit for its people, is in some part because this leftist government has been elected, but it's also because Chile's been the world's copper vendor for 120 years, and they've been pissed off about it for 120 years. And the way that the kind of economic shape of this next boom is, looks, basically the same. Corporations with their headquarters in Toronto or Switzerland or the UK take the minerals out, they leave holes in the ground, and the people who live on the richest lands end up poor again.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I definitely wanted to spend some time on the global South in particular, but I mean, one thing that we've talked a lot on this program is sort of like what the IRA means, right? And while it's certainly impressive in a lot of ways to see, some more motivation and investment into, renewable energy or things like that, one thing that I think is really notable about Biden's plan versus maybe a Green New Deal or something like that is that it leaves, I mean, not just a huge area. I mean, it's very much predicated on the idea of like private investment and private control. So, I mean, obviously we talk about how enthusiastic and excited everybody is about the IRA, but I mean, could you give people more of a sense about, how big of a maybe paradigm shift this might be for the mining industry and its relationship, to the United States as a whole?
Yeah. So, I mean, the IRA, on the kind of battery metals side, I think that's one of the more complicated parts of the law, simply because for the last 30 years, the U.S. and Canada and Europe has been happy to outsource the dirty work to China, essentially, when it comes to metal processing. And between Trump and Biden, both administrations have been pretty hawkish on China. They suddenly look around and they see that 80+% of all rare earth metal processing is in China, and more than 70% of lithium. And lithium is like the battery metal. We cannot get away from lithium as of right now. And so, the IRA is just this kind of fire hose of money and incentives for all sorts of things. But when it comes to the battery metal side, it's really hard to reverse the economic inertia of, NAFTA deindustrialization and just kind of the way we've outsourced, this part of the supply chain. So, I do think you already are seeing battery plants popping up in the U.S. Here and there. But in terms of my sense from PDAC is that, people are really excited about the amount of money. I do think that the IRA is not going to be, it'll be really hard to kind of transform the U.S. into this battery making, giant in anything under 10 years, so maybe in 10 to 15 years, we'll look back and suddenly, there'll be this, kind of manufacturing boom. On the other hand, we might look back and companies took in incentives and explored plans and realized it's still cheaper to do it somewhere else. And as you said, you asked about the labor side. I mean, this is the other part of it, is that, the auto workers union has been up in arms about this, that as they should be, that a big three auto worker in Detroit makes $35 an hour, something like that, at kind of like a baseline, and a non-union EV shop in the US, it's like $16 or $17 an hour. So there was a long Twitter thread a couple months ago by Thea Riofrancos. She's a great writer and an academic, I think, at Providence. Might be getting that wrong on this stuff. Talking about how, like, the IRA, you can kind of see the extent to which this is an alliance between governments and capital, and also a chance to kind of restrain labor as we build this new green economy. And this also kind of gets at your previous question, which I realize I didn't answer entirely, when it comes to kind of the social justice lingo from the mining industry. I think they know they need to make friends with people like the Biden administration. You need to have an ESG kind of goals. You need to have emissions reductions. You need to have a DEI statement. You need to have evidence that you're treating the tribes nearby well, not out of the goodness of their heart, but because this isn't the old coal barons anymore who can just trample people. You kind of need to look green and climate conscious if you're going to get those IRA money, those IRA dollars. But it also means that, like with a lot of kind of corporate identity representation speak, when it comes to the actual extractive forces on the ground, they're no less fierce when it comes to building mines in the DRC, in the Congo, or in kind of some of these other places where between government demands and companies' willingness to kind of go in and start digging. I mean, a mine is still a mine, whatever the ESG statement looks like.
Yeah, I mean, well, on that, like, a mine being a mine, I mean, let's talk a little bit about, let's maybe start with the Americas, right? Because, one of the things that I think is really important here is, like, all of this is happening, and like, so look, there's going to be a lot of demand for these things. As you note in your piece, wind turbines, solar, and batteries are, like, highly, dependent on significant amounts of minerals, right? So these are going to be things that there's going to be increased demand for. Obviously, most of the listeners here know, for example, like, the history of Chile. I'm sure most people here remember, maybe it was tongue-in-cheek, whatever, but it still showed an orientation. When the coup in Bolivia happened against Evo Morales, Elon Musk, maybe jokingly or whatever, but it's very cynical and very sinisterly said, like, we'll coup whoever we want, right? Because people were making the argument, like, hey, there's probably a lithium component to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so could you talk about this a little bit? What's been going on in a lot of these countries, and two, how, like, people like Lula, how Boric, how Luis Arce are being sort of spoken about at PDAC by some people you're able to speak to.
So, we'll start in South America. There's this thing called the lithium triangle, which is Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. And it has more than half of the world's known lithium reserves, and it might be more like 75% of the world's lithium reserves. Chile has the largest known lithium reserves in the world. And as I'm sure your listeners know, there's been this wave of left-wing governments that have come to power in South and Central America over the past 5-ish years. And there's a trend that all of them had explicitly anti-extractive campaign planks when it came to preventing mining pollution, increased respect for the rights of indigenous communities, and then some sort of greater benefit to the to these countries' populations. So this is Peru, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, and some of the news that was kind of circling around PDAC when it was happening was that Gabriel Boric, the president of Chile, had they had that failed constitutional referendum, and what part of the referendum would have included full nationalization of all their lithium, and there was kind of whispers that, you know, even though the referendum failed, Boric's government might just do it anyway. And so, you know, one of Boric's top mining officials is at PDAC, and he's talking to this room full of like Canadian mining executives. So you had these kind of really unusual kind of these interesting people all in the same room together, these representatives of a socialist government, kind of talking to these investors, and kind of towing this line between saying like, hey, like we want to change how Chilean mines its copper and lithium, enormous producers of both. I think top copper producer and second largest lithium producer in the world, but also, you know, not wanting to kind of spook all these, you know, because they're two active private lithium companies operating in Chile, and kind of not wanting to scare them off. So, you know, I have all these quotes in the piece. His name's Willie Crack. And you know, talking about how, you know, they are, you know, like we're not the scary socialists you've heard of, but like we're also not. It's not just like Chile's open for business. And the interesting thing is, it's hard to know this exactly, but about a month after PDAC, Chile went ahead and nationalized the lithium. So I kind of want to speculate whether his mining official was kind of like trying to keep the mining world calm while they were figuring things out, and then they announced nationalization. And they're not immediately kicking out all the private interests. They're giving them a chance to partner as a minority partner with Chile's now national lithium company, which is a branch of its national copper company, which has an interesting history because it was formed by Salvador Allende in the 70s. It was the last left-wing governor of Chile before Pinochet came to power in a coup that the CIA supported. So like the relationship between Chile, the minerals it holds, and, you know, Western capital, it goes back decades and decades. And, you know, a lot of the political turmoil, you know, from certain views, you can get down to it being about all the copper it had, you know, back then.
No, sorry.
So yeah, and then, you know, you're referring to how they're talking about it. So one of the other kind of speeches there was given by this, one of the kind of characters in the mining world. And if you read any part of my story, I know it's long, you know, go down to Robert Friedland, his address. So, you know, he's the head of this giant mining company called Ivanhoe. He's in his 70s. He was just this like hippie taking LSD in the 70s, and like legend has it he helped Steve Jobs come up with the name Apple because they were tripping together in an apple orchard. And in his speech, he's just all over the place. He's like making fun of Biden, and he's comparing the mining industry to the Blues Brothers. But then he just goes on this rant about all the lefties you know, lefty governments in South America. And he talks about the 36-year-old communist in Chile, that'd be Boric, and he talks about how, you know, the fact that, you know, that he's a crook because he went to jail, and he went on and on about Evo Morales, who is not the president of Bolivia anymore. But one of the kind of underlying motivations to all of this is that Friedland's company Ivanhoe has gigantic mines being planned in the Congo and in South Africa. So, you know, part of the message to the audience is like, hey, you don't like all of these socialists asking you to pay up in Chile and Peru and Bolivia? Well, come to the Congo. Like, you know, we don't have these problems there. You know, and Ivanhoe, his mines in the Congo are partnered with one of China's largest state-owned companies, and I mean they're gigantic. They're going to be, you know, of the highest, like, you know, hundreds of thousands of tons per year of the highest grade copper at full production, and platinum, nickel, rhodium, gold, like this, all sorts of stuff that's actually in the South African mine. But it's just kind of every battery and rare earth metal that's going to be needed. Friedland's got a mine in Western Africa that can supply that. And this does kind of point to some of this geopolitical stuff. So in some, Chile has so much lithium that Western governments kind of have to play ball. So the Chancellor of Germany went to Chile this spring and basically kind of kissed the ring, as it were, and said, we will build copper processing plants here. We will, if severance taxes are higher, we'll pay, like, whatever you need to do to get the German automakers the lithium and copper they need. So it's to that extent, it's working. And the two private companies that operate in Chile look like they're going to partner with the state, because that was kind of the deal. Like Chile says, you partner with our state-owned company, or we'll kick you out when your current lease ends. And it looks like they're going to play ball. On the other hand, it is the fact that the Western African operations, in a lot of cases, these governments, not just the DRC but Zambia, are not, have a much more kind of, there's a lot more artisanal mining, small scale mining. Conflict has allowed, a lot of these, the big corporations, both Western and Chinese, to kind of, have a ton of power, especially China and the Congo. That you can kind of operate without some of these requirements to pay up, I guess. And so it is creating this, yet another resource rush into Western Africa that has a long and, obviously dark history. But you can see it happening. So the Chinese have they have their own exploitative relationship with Western African countries, signing minerals deals, like often loading them up with these debt deals, and then mining enormous amounts of cobalt and copper and other stuff. The U.S. is now, again, a little late to the game, but trying to get in on the game. They sent Blinken and Kamala Harris to Western Africa, again, just this spring, to try to sign memorandums of understanding with the DRC and with Zambia to try to reroute some of that cobalt and copper. But the way that Friedland was talking about, his operations in Western Africa, it really is just a gigantic, kind of can't overstate the extent to which this is a new version of the globe extracting resources from that region, and the benefit to the people is negligible.
And I think this is just like there's a larger point here, I think, for leftists or people to understand too, is that, like, winning national power is like only a part of the fight, right? Because there's this international capital system. And if it's something like extraction or like global finance, you see this all the time in South America in particular. A left-wing government comes into power, and then basically, like, the financial machine outside of their country is saying, "Oh, we're not going to play around if you guys, we're not going to provide funding or investment if you guys do this, and that," right? So these things are really, really difficult. And I think, when you're trying to look at the legacy, for example, some of the pink tide and left wing governments, they're up against a lot. But in the last couple of minutes, and I know this is a broad question, but I know you wrote this piece. I know you think about this a lot. It seems very definite that, right, there's going to be this kind of resource boom, right? There's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of need for it, frankly, too. Could you maybe sort of map out potential futures, right? Because it looks like it might be going one way, right? But maybe there's other models or other ideas out there.
Yeah, and so it is this, you could kind of go on and on about the ways in which, kind of governments, military power, and then globalized financial capital are all kind of shaping this world to come, and that it looks like the the boom on the scale that I describe in this article that the attendees of PDAC are expecting, that is going to happen. But it really is amazing to which when you look closely at the way that American EVs are put together. So the way that batteries are put together in the U.S., the sort of EVs we like really big cars, right? And there are also loopholes that allow car company, it's in some ways more attractive to build an electric truck or an electric SUV rather than, Chevy just discontinued the Chevy Bolt or Bolt, whatever it is, which is the most popular EV that they've ever made. In replacement, they're going to build more trucks and SUVs. And to kind of power big American electric cars, that requires a lot of, it requires very nickel dense batteries. And nickel is really, really nasty to mine. And it's, a lot of it is in Indonesia and the Philippines, and countries that regularly have gigantic tropical storms hit them, where there's, the kind of almost a certainty if you have, a nickel mine with enormous waste pits, that if you get a tropical storm that just hammers the country, there's going to be runoff, there's going to be pollution, there's going to be a dam breaking. But it doesn't have to be this way. Batteries, I cite this study in the story that kind of tracks all these different development paths, and even just like reducing the size of EV batteries could reduce the amount of, lithium and copper and nickel demand. Many, I forget the exact range, but it's like a pretty significant percentage of demand could be cut into. And if you combined that with more walkable cities, better public transit, we could really cut into the amount of this stuff that we need to dig out of the ground, let alone their Chinese EVs, the EVs that tend to be purchased and are used in China. This is getting to the limits of my biochemistry here, but use the battery setup is much less nickel dense, so you could even have different kinds of batteries that would need smaller cars, but that wouldn't be quite so harmful. Going kind of all the way up the supply chain, I am pulling this up here, but that the study that I cite, you could cut into U.S. lithium demand by 2050 by 42% if you had all these various combinations of smaller EV batteries, denser cities, battery recycling. That kind of puts the kind of 100% recycling, getting everything back in the system. But that's not the way things are going right now. Again, kind of on this ESG point, all the car makers and all the mining companies at PDAC will say all the right things about battery recycling, but they make money with increased demand and building new mines. That's the real excitement in the room. And if it was kind of interesting the way in which that ESG stuff would be, you would have panels about that, and then if you go into another room, then it's just investors talking dollars and cents. So you do get that, this is the sort of stuff we have to say, but in terms of reducing the size of EV batteries, all the arrows are pointing the other direction.
And well, Nick, I really appreciate you taking the time and the piece. The piece is a good prospect, Mining Climate Anxiety, for profit in the Drift magazine. There'll be links below for people to check it out. And again, brother, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Happy to do it.
Good job, David.
Thanks, man. No, it's a great piece. People should definitely check out on the Drift magazine. Link below in the show notes if you need it. I mean, I think being able to reckon with some of the difficult challenges and realities here, and also I mean, like this is a massive issue. I mean, think about what happened with AMLO when he said that there's going to be a national stake in the lithium production in the country of Mexico. I mean, the freak out, even in the New York Times, right? It's always amazing how
Authoritarian.
liberals like act like, oh, we're above the old days of American imperialism. And then it's like, oh, yeah, crazy authoritarian AMLO. I mean, I don't really love business, but he's probably not going to be doing something good with it. Well, why do you think that these nasty Canadian companies are going to be doing something nicer with Mexico's lithium? Why are we even having that conversation? So, and dealing with that, particularly, in the question of lithium for people who, push for super high solar and battery usage. I mean, this is some of the realities that we're going to sort of run up against.
I know, man, and it's all and this is why I don't like just credit. I don't like the just simple, even if he wasn't an edgelord, the simple crediting of Elon for the so-called democratization of personal
Oh,
automobile.
yeah.
I think it'd be great to have really efficient, cheap personal automobiles, but I also think, and I think a lot more people agree more and more, that it'd be nicer to have like really good public transportation.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think, taking into consideration like what we need to be doing and what we should be sort of focusing on is important. I mean, I do think that like we should be able to, explore lots of different options. And remember that, it's like oftentimes not like a lot of these things are like, oh, well, consumers pick this or that, but a lot of times those choices are sort of constrained and designed to look a certain
Right.
way. I mean, look at automobile ownership. I mean, look, I'm somebody who loves, like having a vehicle, right? That the freedom that you get, the ability to move around is great. There's also times I wish, I had better public transit options. That's why I support it here. And like, anyways, these are going to be some of the thorny questions that we have to rub up against. The problem is we're not anywhere near, the driver's seat, forgive the metaphor, of these
Right.
kind of things. And in the meantime, right? So even if, okay, so, in the moment where it's like, okay, we have these things that we advocate for. So, okay, well, capital looks like it's about to invest in a lot of lithium production. What is that going to look like? And what do we need to be sort of prepping our comrades around the world for? What do we need to be doing internally? I mean, all the fights in this country about how EVs are being produced as a way to sort of break union labor in the UAW, right? For people who don't know this story, it's because the big three are building out new plants and saying, oh, well, an electric vehicle, that's different than a combustion engine. So actually, we don't think that the union contracts that we negotiate with the UAW play in this arena, right? And this is a huge fight that's going on right now, right? So there's all these things that are going to be going on that we have to be able to do two things, right? Advocate for the future that we want, the things that we want, and also be able to play ball today and recognize some of the pitfalls, problems, and unfortunately, at times even compromises that might have to be made.
Yeah. Folks, let's do this Jacob Fry story. So we talk a lot about threats to democracy, and I genuinely think, for instance, the Minnesota GOP is an absolute threat to democracy. If given full control of the state of Minnesota, I think it'd be very bad. Do not like those guys. I think they're fascists. That said, we have a little guy named Jacob Fry who is making the rounds, getting some positive press for some things related to housing. And it set me off. So let's talk about threats to democracy. And I'll just say, I did choose this because it was a suggested picture, but there's our boy Jacob Fry. Left Reckoning 85. And I'm going to stop sharing this. I might have to have you bring this
Okay,
up.
I'll share it.
Clearly that's a problem for this. But in Left Reckoning 85, and with the earlier discussion with GP Jacob, we talked about Jacob Fry as sort of the prototypical neoliberal Democrat mayor.
Mhm.
Young, he does like TikTok dances sometimes.
We played those on the show.
Exactly, including that was with supporters of Latricia Vita, who we'll hear from. So yeah, here's our boy. And if you just go to the next one, what prompted me on this is I saw this today and it drove me insane. Kate Willett, I think, tweeted this out, but this is a quote tweet of a guy named Connor Sen, who's another guy whose politics I don't like. This sort of neoliberal type of Democrat. With construction loan rates where they are, I wouldn't expect much multifamily construction on the West Coast, even if YIMBYs are winning lots of political fights. And this Yimby quote tweets that and says, 4 things have to line up for new housing to be built. Let's see. I wonder what's left out of here. 1, zoning/entitlements. 2, construction costs. 3, interest rates. 4, rents. And then he goes, with 2 and 3 increasing, no indication of coming back down, ... We will unfortunately have to wait for rents to increase.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say, like, that is exactly my problem with all these guys, is how little they incorporate into their philosophy, as Shakespeare says. It was like, yes, we could actually just start building this stuff. Like, this is obvious. Like, why, how impoverished are our imaginations in terms of policy that we can't think of anything but, oh, well, I guess we got to feed the rentiers from the people who are already squeezed.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's like, and maintain a certain system of power, which, it's not just like, oh, we're talking like a Foucauldian sense, oh, like power, right? We're talking about, if you are somebody who derives your wealth from extracting value from renters, well, what's the thing that you want to see happen as much as possible? You want to see those rents go up. As long as those things are controlled by private interests, there's always going to be an upward pressure on rents. And I don't want to interrupt your segment, so I'll talk about it a little bit later. But that's why you sort of have to push back on that kind of thing. And there's no kind of one quick trick to the housing crisis that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people have sort of fallen into. But let's see where this goes.
So let's take a sidebar and look how Mayor Fry dealt with the Uber Lyft thing recently. If you go to this next page, which is by the Sahan Journal, which I recommend anybody in following Minneapolis politics, they take a look at. There's really great coverage of this stuff. But Mayor Fry vetoes Minneapolis rideshare ordinance, announces changes for Uber drivers. And basically, to do some quotes from Robin Wansley, who was a former guest on this program, the independent socialist on the city council. This veto is inexcusable betrayal of Minneapolis workers. The ordinance was developed over 8 months with consultation of drivers, city staff, and national experts. As a council member, Jacob Fry voted to approve a $15 minimum wage, but evidently he is ready to abandon any commitment to living wages. Eid Ali, just remember the name the word Eid, because that's going to come up later. But Eid Ali, president, who is the president of the Minnesota Uber Lyft Drivers Association, told Sahan Journal that Tuesday's news was disappointing given how much effort drivers put into getting the ordinance passed. It's a little bit of a gray day for thousands of families who were expected a different outcome, but it is what it is, and we are going to work on some alternatives that we have ahead of us. If you just go to the next one, David. Shout out to Jason Chavez, who said Mayor Fry's veto is a slap in the face to thousands of workers in Minneapolis. As council members, our job isn't to count on pinky promises from multi-billion-dollar corporations that they'll do the right thing. Our job is to make laws that guarantee workers can earn a living wage. And if you just go to the next one, that's what the mayor has done. Basically, get from. And not even from Lyft, just from Uber, says that, yeah, we're going to try to get you to $15. Lyft spokesperson CJ Macklin said, by attempting to jam through this deeply flawed bill in less than a month, it threatened the rideshare operating within the city. We support a minimum earnings framework for drivers, but it should be part of a broader framework that balances the needs of riders and drivers. That is a company lying to you.
There's an omission there.
Yeah, we're just here for the riders and the customers. And if we could just, these guys, they're fighting all the time. And it's like, I don't know which one of the kids I want to give ice cream to. They need surplus value from this whole operation so they can pay the investors who have sunk money into these things and the lobbying efforts for them, so that they can, monopolize these industries and draw that money back on the backs of underpaid workers in these areas. And they threatened, and this is the second time there's been vetoes on this in Minnesota. First, Governor Walz did it after a state senator, I can't remember, Fateh, who's apparently promising a future state action on this. But Walz vetoed that when we were going to try to be like, oh, look at Walz getting the thing done. And then the second one of these industries says, actually, that doesn't work for us at all. These executives, which even progressive, and I think Walz is better than Fry for what it's worth, whatever. But like, they're still going to kowtow to what the industry says. So that brings us to this news story, and Fry has been getting positive press from Bloomberg here, which talks about the first American city to tame inflation owes its success to affordable housing. Now, I want to just say up front to the Yimbys, I am not someone saying, hey, hands off of single family exclusive zoning. I mean, I feel like we even might have mentioned that in that discussion of the city councilors talking about last time. But like, I am pro generic reform of this, but we need to keep an eye on how this is being used by the people that are actually controlling politics right now. So this story, first American city to tame inflation. No place has put, and this is all good stuff, generally speaking. No place in the U.S. has put inflation in the rearview mirror quite as fast as Minneapolis. Blah, blah, blah. That's largely due to a region-wide push to address one of the most intractable issues, both the Fed and American consumers, right? For both the Fed and American consumers, rising housing costs. Well before pandemic-related supply chain snarls and labor shortages roiled the economy, the city of Minneapolis eliminated zoning that allowed only single-family homes, and since 2018 has invested $320 million for rental assistance and subsidies. That is all good. Jacob Fry, if this was all you could ever do, it's something, man. That helped unleash a boom of construction in apartments and condos in the region that proved to be a powerful antidote against inflation, given that the cost of shelter accounts for more than a third of overall U.S. price index. Minneapolis shelter prices were up a half at the nation's annual price in May, and Fry gloats a little bit at the end of this. There are some things to keep in mind, though. You can move to the next slide. And this is all a part of this Minneapolis 2040 project. And I think, look, spending $320 million on rent subsidies, that's better than not doing that. And totally. But like, we need to keep an eye on also who this is affecting. And this is a very raced dynamic in Minneapolis. 49% of all households in Minneapolis are cost burden. It's not equal across groups. Still high for even white people, I will say. Over 50% of Black households, over 45% of American Indian and Hispanic households in Minneapolis are cost burden, whereas 1 in 3 white households are cost burden. And a lot of those are, I think, like, there's a lot of, like, Ilhan Omar Somali population. And the other thing that I do think we need to keep in mind before, Jacob Fry saying a lot of people were expecting gentrification. None of that's happened. You go to the next slide here, and I think this is a pretty important sort of thing to keep in mind, is Minneapolis is one of these states that has lost citizens. It lost citizens in 2022. That has an impact on housing, right? These states that have a lot of people moving into it, that's causing a lot of inflation. So again, like, I'll take the $320 million in rent subsidies and the improved zoning, but let's not count our eggs before they hatch. And then we get to the real divide here, which is that this idea that, hey, I support this and I support that. There is a conflict here, and you can skip the GP Jacob thing. That's just it led for 85, where we talked about
people should definitely watch it though. GP Jacob is awesome, really
good. This is where it gets dark. What happened to rent control in Minneapolis? This is by Roshan Abraham in city. I can't remember what the
in backyard.
Oh, Next City, yeah. And just to read this head here, and this is how fundamentally, well, he just lets it out here. When Minneapolis voters went to the ballot box in November 2021 and with a 53% majority empowered their city council to draft a rent control ordinance, they may have expected that ordinance to be ready for their approval by now. But 2 years later, the earliest that a rent regulating policy could be back before voters is in 2024. Implementation would be even further down the line. That's because on June 28th, a winding rent control saga in the Twin Cities took its most recent turn at a city council meeting held during Eid al-Adha, wherein 3 Muslim council members were absent for the religious holiday. The council voted 5-4 not to advance the draft ordinance to committee. a procedural hurdle that means a ballot proposal cannot go before voters this November as some had hoped. The three absent council members, Jeremiah Ellison, Jamal Osman, and Ashita Shugtai, are all supporters of rent control. Shugtai and Osman wrote the rent control policy in question based on a working group's recommendations. Their presence at the meeting would have assured that the policy advanced to the next stage in the process. And we have some reaction on the next one here. Oh, and yeah, so that and the you have these different folks who are basically like, look, we had to continue the business, and that's not the case. They could have postponed and waited for the full council to get there. So it's just chicken shit. Now, ultimately, they would have needed 9, I think, to get it onto the ballot in 2020 this year. So I think, and so they would have needed one of the people that decided, like, yeah, let's vote over the absent Muslims that are gone for religious reasons. Let's go over there. So I don't think you would have probably got one of them, but I mean, disgusting, right? And I mean, and anti-democratic, because as we'll just put this up here. Councilmember Latricia Vita. Oh yeah, I mean, so I don't have much of the reaction from the representatives, but they're like, yeah, like our constituents like wanted us to do this. This is.
I mean, come on, let's not miss this for a second. I mean, it's absolutely cynical to do what just happened here, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, like what it's about is really important, but I mean that is fundamental anti-democratic nonsense. To sit here and say, for a minority religion, right? So those aren't necessarily always going to be federal holidays or non-work days. To try to push through something, knowing that a certain segment of the working population, the people who are working in government with you, aren't going to be present, and that's going to give you numerical advantage, right? So some people have to choose between being able to practice their faith, their religion, or to see some of the most sinister, cynical kind of policies happen in the city of Minneapolis. I mean, that is some really wicked, evil shit.
It really
is in a city that prides itself generally on being very progressive and open to lots of different people.
And guess what? Like the distribution of that skews poor and non-white of the people that have been disenfranchised there. So like, not only like we talked with Chippy Jacob, like electorates are conservative in general, and then you're just going to completely say, I mean, it's really despicable, even if it wasn't, like you said, for such an important policy to their constituents that they support, that they passed an ordinance for. And I mentioned, and I'm not going to play it, but Jacob Fry doing TikTok dances, and look, if he was doing that and he was supportive of rent control, the aesthetics of that are entirely different. But that was actually with this council member Latricia Vita here, who has been rumored as maybe an AIPAC tap for challenging Ilhan Omar. But council member Latricia Vita was even more strongly opposed. Rent control has not helped anywhere. It's not a thing. True. It's not going to work in this city. We have work to do, Vita said in the June meeting. She also said rent control would stop the building of housing. Now, this is important, and this is what's got the fear in some of these squishes, and it's important to address this. Would stop the building of housing, echoing concerns that Minneapolis would face similar issues as St. Paul. St. Paul voters approved a rent control ordinance in November 2021 with a 3% annual cap on rent increases and no exemption for new construction. Very strict. The voters passed this. It followed a study from the University of Minnesota Center for Urban and Regional Affairs showing that rent control policies did not lead to limits on new construction, but could lead to landlords converting apartments into condos and removing them from the rental market. The St. Paul law went into effect May 1st, 2022, with significant loopholes that allowed landlords to raise rents by up to 8% only by, quote, self-certifying that their costs had risen, with those certifications only selectively audited, as Next City reported last year. Landlords could also raise rents between 8 to 15% with a more rigorous review from the city. The St. Paul law still allowed landlords to raise rents higher than the city's 20-year average annual rent increases, but developers, some of whom openly opposed the law, pulled building permits, saying that they could not get construction financing with the rent control law in place. And this is the important paragraph. The decrease was sharp, with HUD estimating that there was a 48% decrease in building permits in 2022 from the year prior. But HUD's data also show that the slowdown began in June 2021, more than a year before St. Paul's rent control policy was implemented and 11 months before the November 2021 vote. This suggests that developers pulling permits were reacting to the perception of the rent control policy rather than its impact. And I mean, that's, I think, a pretty important thing. And that actually tracks with what GP Jacob and I said, which is that, like, look, I support, like, obviously I support rent control. We need to actually be affirmatively producing housing for people, because it's not just going to happen with the like, unless like developers like it's not just going to happen on its own, right? Like, clearly. And I think that's why it's so frustrating with that Bloomberg piece that's giving Fry a lot of shine about this, because I think that's propaganda, because I don't think you can draw that kind of strong inference. Minnesota has never had super high housing prices. So just to credit it all for this minor reform, meanwhile you have him doing this type of shit, disenfranchising people who want rent control, is a huge problem.
Oh yeah. And like let's talk about like two quick things here. One, there's a fancy word for what that is. What you're just talking about with builders not building, not because of any economic reasoning, but actually just because of what they're calling the perceived. No, that's what that's called is called a capital strike. And what a capital strike is the ability of people with money to be able to withhold investment to get the certain kind of policies that they want. This happens not just all across the country. This happens all across the world. Where there are forces out there that are trying to break down and attack democracy. Because here's the thing about rent control, right? And I know we might want to talk about some international examples in a second, Matt. Rent control works. There's a great piece. I'll pull it up really fast. There's a great piece by J.W. Mason, which y'all can read to get like the full details of this in Jacobin magazine, which breaks down why rent control works as a policy. Neoliberals are wrong. Rent control protects tenants, is good for the housing market, promotes lively cities, and reduces one of the biggest sources of rising inequality today. 100% true. And again, people should read the entirety of the article, but let's just go here really fast. A number of recent studies have looked at the effects of rent regulations on housing supply, focusing on changes in rent regulations in New Jersey and California and the elimination of rent control in Massachusetts. Contrary to the predictions of the simple supply and demand model, none of these studies have found evidence that introducing or strengthening rent regulations reduces new housing construction, or that eliminating rent regulation increases construction. Most of these studies do, however, find that rent control is effective at holding down rents. Because here's the thing, there is a fundamental reality here that rent housing is something that's is a good that there is always going to be a need for. As long as you have people living in a city, there's going to be a need for housing, right? What capitalists do right now is they try to hold the market, they try to hold cities, they try to hold localities hostage, and they make these kind of arguments, and they even sometimes do cynical moves like this to say we're not going to invest in something for political reasons, not for economic ones, right? But rent control as a policy works tremendously well at protecting the bottom line of working and middle class Americans. And you know what doesn't work, despite all of the YIMBY nonsense about it, is building a bunch of luxury housing for the rich. That does not trickle down to the rest of us. It has been disproven time and time again. They continue using this kind of very classroom level economics, right? The kind of economics that libertarians love to use, right? That is not reflective of the world or of reality, but it's just, oh, look, this number goes up, that number goes down, right? That's how the economics works. No, it's not, right? Because it misses the political economy here. If you have a strong state, if you have a strong government that says, hey, look, this is what we're going to have people pay. We're not going to allow you to make constant increases and all these kind of things. People will continue to put units up for rent, and they will continue to build more homes. Why? Because there's still going to be money in it. There's still going to be money in it. It is a policy that has worked. Now, it is not either like the final policy. The best policy is, instead of trying to negotiate with these tyrants and these monsters out here who are literally trying to make people homeless by keeping them out of houses, is to take that under public control and to build community housing or build public housing that is either owned by the community or housing that is owned by the government and by that extension, the rest of us, right? And in this country too, what happened with public housing? There was a time when it was seen as something that was an incredible achievement of American society. Look, we house people if they need it. We find ways to make sure that we don't have homeless in this country. Well, the right realized, hey, this is not a good look. Because if we can't extract as much value from these people, our bottom lines are going to suffer. And more importantly, for people who are employers, if we can't threaten people with destruction if they stand up and fight against us, then this is a problem. So what happened with public housing in this country? This is why it has such a negative connotation with most people. Public housing became poor quality, right? Because that was disinvested in, and punitive, right? And there's a lot of people who've done a lot of work looking at what happened during the neoliberal turn in this country, at what happened to public housing, right? People were constantly being inspected. They didn't have this kind of freedom. They didn't have personal autonomy. They were over policed, right? And why was that? It wasn't because there were social problems that needed to be dealt with. It was because they wanted to sort of threaten, harass, and harass people, right? And the Democratic Party, as we know, ends up participating in that same kind of system. And that really damaged public housing in this country. But you look, there are multiple other models. I know we might talk about Germany in a second, so I won't go in there. But look at Vienna, right? Vienna is a country that is at a 100-year project to deal with the housing crisis, right? And this is something where, the vast majority of people in Vienna live in what's called public housing. Is something that's relative to your income, what you are paying. So it's a much different system than ours, where people are sort of selecting based, I'm going to get into my wealthy neighborhood and sort of wall myself off from the rest of the society. No, you can be living next to, somebody who makes far more or far less than you in those kind of systems. And it works. People like it. And you are able to do all sorts of incredible things. Like there's bike cities, right? Areas where, you don't have a need to have a car ownership, right? There might be a vehicle that's rented out by the people who are living in the unit, that's sort of collectively owned. But for the most part, you can get around using a bike, right? And just like the possibilities are endless if you take control of these kind of things. So yeah, in the short term, rent control 100% works. And anyone who continues to make this argument that it doesn't is just straight up lying, or they're ignorant. But more importantly than not, we need to be building public housing, because dealing with these kind of tyrants, they actually will make kind of sacrifices. Again, not because economics forced them to, because they're sore losers. And they know that they can wait out these kind of waves, because, they can wait out something for 4 or 5 years, right? Because that's sort of what the cycle has to be on these kind of things. When you have spineless liberal politicians who say, oh man, I heard from a developer that they're scared of doing this. So yeah, we're actually going to walk back all of our promises and policies that we've campaigned on, right? Very easy game. And that's a lesson that I think the rich have learned in this country.
I mean, exactly. That's why I, included that little bit with the Uber Lyft thing, because that is, the chosen executive of the people deciding, what, you guys are wrong. I'm conferring with the business guys over here, the people who are trying to suck up profit to pay back their investors for their provision of things. Like, and that's why it's so perverse about this. Like, it'd be one thing if like it was like cabbies and they were all unionized, right? Like, no, these companies are operating at losses, but they're expecting to pay back the worst people on the planet. Like the people that are like, when we talk about like tech, like what are we talking about when we're talking about like the tech executives that are ruining the world? It's these guys. And yeah, I mean, I think like what's frustrating is the alternative seems so available. I mean, not just, here, this Germany's ruling Social Democratic Party is set to propose a 3-year rent break across the country. But, also St. Paul, of course, passed their own. But the actual more affirmative thing of like state produced housing, it's very easy for me in New York with this experience I've had here, because they have lotteries here. I've never actually joined one, but I know people who do. And like, that seems like such a better, you go into a lottery for housing that you can afford, but that the state actually provides at a decent level, not just like completely like screwing people. I think people would way prefer that than dealing with these brokers. And I it's hard for me to generalize too much from New York but my sense is that other areas are becoming more like New York than the other way around, or than the other way. And I don't think anybody likes to deal with real estate brokers. I don't know.
Oh
Maybe
yeah.
I'm wrong.
I mean, no, and the reality about the housing crisis in this country, as I say time and time again, despite what those on the reactionary right will say is like, well, if you don't like the cost of housing, just move somewhere else, right? Well, as you noted earlier, you know where the housing crisis is getting worse by the day? States like Texas and New York, right? Sorry, Texas and Florida, where like people have like probably not for the political reasons that the right wingers say, but solely for economic reasons. Oh, well, I'll move somewhere where the cost of living is a little bit less. Well, guess what? It moves very fast because it goes up really fast because then you have, you know, high demand, low stock of housing. And then hell, you come to a place, I don't know what the situation is like in Florida, but you come to a place like Texas where you have very little to no rental protections, you know, and your life can be a nightmare. I mean, you can get a rent increase, $700, $800, $900. And then what are you supposed to do? Where are you supposed to go? The rents in Austin in the past 12, 13 years have skyrocketed in a way that is just so frightening when you see what like a one bedroom apartment might have cost in the 2010s versus what it costs in 2023. And the realization that the vast majority of people cannot survive and pay to live in the city. What does that mean? People have to go further and further and further out. And then you get the problem of like all these small towns now around Austin are becoming unaffordable, and places that weren't designed to be major cities or major population hubs are now dealing with crises like water, right? In a place, you know, where it gets really hot, we experience droughts, right? You get people moving into small towns in mass because they can no longer survive in Austin because you have this kind of landlord class, you have this property owner class that has been refusing to allow you know, the kind of expansions that are necessary, not to mention the problem of the state government here, which will wage war on any kind of progressive policy that's passed on the municipal level. I mean, it's a real nightmare. And I think the role of socialists is not to fall for this kind of YIMBY stuff, right? Which again, like, it's not that we disagree, for example, that yeah, there's definitely going to have to be zoning reform. But remember that, like, you know, that these guys are not your friends, and a lot of them are fairly nefarious actors who are celebrating the fact that a lot of progressives have sort of embraced free market economics on these kind of things instead of directing their ire and their frustration at the actual class that is responsible for this kind.
Because the implicit message there, just to, you know, really lower it down to like 144p, is the government made this problem and it's just in the way. And if you just let the private developers cook, then they will. And like, I gotta say, like, it's so jaded. There's like this new giant tower in downtown Brooklyn, like Tower of Mordor style skyscraper. And you know, I've come from North Dakota. I like tall buildings, but I'm so jaded about it because I saw the floor plan for one of those things, and it is tiny as hell. It's tiny as hell, and it's super expensive. And that's who we're partnering with, is people who want like I don't trust man, like it's really, these developers, like you said, they're not like partners in this sort of thing. And it's wild to me that even people who can afford like 5K rent in New York City, like what they'll put up with.
Well, what's that new neighborhood for like the ultra rich that they built in Manhattan, where this like kind of freaky like neo modern architecture? You know what I'm talking about? It's
Lower
like
Manhattan sort of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, but no, but it's like a neighborhood. They built like a huge building, and
Up
all I'm
by
saying is like,
Tribeca.
no, Matt, it's like not an old school neighborhood. It's like a new thing. Come on, you
Okay.
gotta go outside of Brooklyn every once in a while.
Yeah,
Experience
no,
the
I don't
city.
know. New York neighborhood.
I'm forgetting it right now, and it's sort of embarrassing to forget it because it's a buzzy word. Anyway, that hasn't dropped housing costs in New York City, right?
Right.
New housing for billionaire tech guys has not lowered the cost of living in New York City for people. That is a fallacy through and through.
And like, I gotta say, like, the type of, I don't know. I don't want to get too distracted on New York. I have no idea what you're talking about though.
I'll find it for you later. I mean, like, it's something that you should know, and I should probably know too. But it's fine. Let's not get distracted on it. Is there anything else we've got to say on the housing?
No, just like, look, generally speaking, like, yeah, man, rezone that shit. But let's stop pretending like that isn't being used for cynical ends. I mean, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and I will just say as a general thing too, like, we do these kind of things on the program a lot, right? Where you see things that are happening at like Hudson Yards, by the way, is
Okay,
the,
right. Yeah.
is the neighborhood that I'm thinking of. Anyway, whatever. We do this on this program. We look at some of the freakouts that are happening at school boards. We look at some of the freakouts that are happening in city council meetings, right? And I have seen this kind of very frightening, like anti-democratic sentiment come up amongst even people on the left with these kind of things. Because what should shock you and frustrate you about these things is what people are saying, what they're mobilized and organized to do and say, right? The opinions that they're expressing, what they're trying to push on society, not the fact that people might be engaged in local politics, right? And one thing that comes out of like the NIMBY YIMBY kind of thing is that like, oh, the people who are participating in local democracy are like bad, right? Obviously the idea is that like, the people who get to spend a lot of time at zoning meetings are people who have like a tremendous financial vested interest and a lot of time to be able to do that. I get where it comes from, but don't for a second start saying that we should these things should be sort of closed off, or that that these kind of openings for politics, for people to be engaged in politics, are bad, because frankly that is the kind of thing that we desperately need to be doing much more of on our side.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole thing is this is just over the people's heads.
Well, folks, we're going to go over the post game, patreon.com/left reckoning. We're going to be taking your calls and questions. You can leave us a voicemail at 1940-289-7234. Again, $5 a month. You sign up, help Matt and I continue doing the show, patreon.com/left reckoning. We're going to be jumping into something that is, a little bit of a hot discussion, and I think it's an important one. I think we're going to do that over in the post game, so that y'all can engage and we can sort of say what we think about it. But we're going to talk about this Cornel West Bernie Sanders thing that's going on. For people who don't know, Bernie Sanders basically, implied that he doesn't think that Cornel West should be running. And for a certain section of progressive who sort of sees themselves as the line between the crazies and the real serious people, I've been having a field day with it. And Matt and I are about to maybe set the record straight on that. So come join us, patreon.com/left reckoning. We'll be talking about that and much, much more. Thanks everybody for joining us this week, and we'll see you soon.
Peace.